the last thing that we discuss is that these effects that are associated with syntactic operations might in fact probably have some semantic implications or semantics consequences, or they also involve some semantic processing, right? So, right. So who cares about semantics? Well, some people care about semantics. So that's going to be the topic of the next classes. But already now, we're going to look at this experiment by Zaccarella and colleagues. So he's also part of Angela Federici's lab. And the goal of this experiment was try to dive deep in the detail of this functional parcellation, which means try to investigate specifically within one region which specific part of this region we would be more sensitive to a particular domain, or to a particular domain of operations, or to particular processes. Okay. And yeah, and this is what we're going to start today. Right. So if you look at this paper, so in the introduction, they start discussing basically the old papers, which kind of concluded that merge cannot be directly investigated. Okay. Can any one of you remind me what merge is in very, very general terms?
It is an operation that basically combines some constituents together, words together.
Words or constituents, right? And what is the outcome of these operations? Of this operation?
A meaning?
Yeah, but more at the more basic level, right? If you combine two things together, then you're going to have a new unit, basically. So the important part of merge is not only combining two things together, but then creating a new unit, which is made of the composition of these two things. And then, yes, of course, meaning is important, right? But also at the syntactic level, you have a new unit, which is basically the union of the two subcomponents, okay? So some people call merge like unification, for instance. So they talk about an analog process, which is unification. Or in linguistic theory, merge would be the syntactic counterpart of semantic composition, all right? Okay, so yeah, so you might wonder why some people claim that merge cannot be directly investigated, because every time that you have merge, you also have semantic composition, right? And so, right, so larger brain activity might mask the subtle brain activity specific to merge, to syntactic merge. And yeah, and yeah, so these processes could be equally involved during the comprehension of any kind of sentences. As long as you have a sentence, or as long as you have a few words that can form a constituent, you have merge. So the question is always, how can we investigate the basic operation if that is present in any kind of linguistic processing we have? Right, so some recent studies provide a conflicting picture. For instance, they found several activation of Broca's area, right? That you might have heard about. And the anterior, yep. Was there a question? No, okay. And the anterior temporal lobe that we haven't really talked about, because the anterior left temporal lobe is considered separate from the areas that we talked about, like STG, STS, and so on. They are more posterior. And then finally, our posterior STG, STS. And again, you have heard about this. And also some other areas, like for instance, the anterior insula or the frontal opercle. So, in these experiments, they said probably emerges from the interaction of all these areas, which are widespread on the left hemisphere, right? And they kind of make up the whole language areas, basically. So here you have Broca, and here you have Wernicke, right? And here you have other stuff. So what can we, where can we go from this, right? So the idea is that of Zaccarella et al. That maybe in this experiment they found all these activations because they were using structures that were too complex. They were using stories, embedded clauses, for instance, sentential modification, long subject-object sentences. So if you feed to the language processor all this stuff, then of course you're going to have all these Christmas tree of different activation in your cortex. But there must be a way to only find a specific activation of the real processor of merge if you create your stimuli in a very simple and effective way. This is Zaccarella's et al.'s conviction. And yeah, so again, in all the other studies, they use several word types, function words, content words, and that might have contributed to all these activations. So the goal of this study is to investigate the brain activation associated only with merge, okay? So the strategy was to find minimal phrases that bear syntactic roles and semantic functions, right? And in particular, to compare two kinds of structures. So prepositional phrases like on the bicycle versus sentence hierarchies like John walks, okay? So in this experiment, they will employ two kinds of constructions. One is a minimal clause with the verb and the subject. And the other one is a prepositional phrase without a verb, okay? And the goal of this is to reduce the complexity and the possible confounds introduced by this complexity in the other studies. So here's the sentences. Das Schiff sinkt, the ship sinks, and auf das Schiff, on the ship, okay? So these two conditions are supposed to require merge because when you process the sentence, first you make the constituent your DP of the ship, and then you merge this with the verb, and you get the whole VP and the whole, let's call it, I don't know, PP or FinP or whatever, right? So first the ship, and then the ship sinks. And the same thing you would do with the prepositional phrase. So first you would do the ship now on the right side, and then you would merge this with your preposition on. And notice that you have no verb here, okay? So the idea is that merge doesn't really care whether you have a verb or not. The only thing that it cares about is that if you can merge two words or two sentences or two constituents or two minimal phrase in order to create a larger union, okay? The control would be random words which are matched by a lot of features like length, familiarity, frequency, and so on and so forth, but they cannot be merged. So stem, sheep, juice, it's not mergeable, right? Sheep juice, probably you can think about a sheep juice, but then stem, sheep juice doesn't make any sense. Lick, mouth, sheep. At the same time, you see that they sound like meaningless list of words, okay? So this would be the control. Is this clear?
Just one thing, merge entails that it makes sense, that it's meaningful.
Not really, right? So the idea is that you could merge even sentences that are not meaningful, because merge only cares about syntactic dependencies. So
Okay.
if you have a sentence like the ship sings, right? let's say from the syntactic perspective, you could still merge the ship with the predicate sings. Although, you know, someone might say, yeah, but, you know, singing requires an animate subject. So you cannot really compose the ship with singing, right? And there is debate about whether animacy, for instance, is grammatically coded or not at the level of syntactic structures. So maybe this is a bad example, but then if I tell you the ship flies, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, but you could still compose these things.
Yeah, but
Or
it's a sentence, so it on the sentence level, it's meaningful. Okay.
yeah,
Got
at
it.
the syntactic level, it can be composed, and then whether
Yeah.
it and then whether you have a meaning mismatch or not, that's the problem about semantics, right? But in this experiment, they actually used you know, phrases that bear syntactic roles and semantic functions. So basically, they would make sense. Okay. But this is a very good question, especially because every time that you have a meaning, then you might have some effects that are due to the meaning and not to pure syntax, right? But the idea is that at least with prepositional phrase, you don't have a finite sentence meaning, because on the ship doesn't tell you much about what's going on, right? So whatever effect of merge you're going to find, it should be present in both structures, okay? It should be elicited by both configurations. That's why they had the prepositional phrase control. And whatever additional effect you might have here, that might be due to the fact that you're creating a real sentence and you're composing your subject with a verb. So that might index some core position at the verb level, which is also involving some semantics, okay? Okay, so if there is no other question, yeah. So short sentences and prepositional phrases and word list control. And the idea is that in the word list controls, you want to remove any additional syntax related activity. So you want to have this word list composed by words that cannot be merged, okay? They cannot be composed. Okay. So here's a prediction. So they predicted that you should find an effect for hierarchy construction in BA44 and an effect depending on verb levels intention integration in BA45. And probably some posterior STS or STG activation due to the thematic role assignment, okay? So probably still related to the verb level integration. And the procedure they used was this. So they would present a word at the center of the screen every 300 milliseconds, and then a fixation dot and the response window. And the task, I'm not sure I remember what was the task. Probably they have to say whether it was a sentence or not or something like this. I don't remember that, but I can check it out. Okay, so what did they find? Guess what? Exactly what they predicted. They found a main effect of merge. So for both constructions, compared to the list controls, the word list controls, they found two peaks of activation, you see. One in BA44, extending to BA45, and one on the posterior superior temporal sulcus, okay? So this is, the blue thing is sentence, and the red thing is phrases, okay? So this is prepositional phrase, and this is sentence. Am I right? Oh, sorry. Right. Yes. So the blue one is a sentence, and the red one is called phrase, as in prepositional phrase. Okay. So a smaller effect in the superior temporal sulcus and a big effect in Broca's area. Now, what we are interested in is to see whether there are differences in peak, okay, especially within Broca's region. And what they found was that the greatest effect, the peak of activation for sentences including the verb, was in BA45, whereas the greatest activation for sentences including a preposition, so for prepositional phrase, was in BA44, specifically in BA44. So they conclude, yeah. So again, you can call BA45 as the most anterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus and the BA44 the most posterior part, right? Because this is posterior and this is anterior. Okay, so again, conclusion quite unsurprising, that Broca's area is found active for complex sentences, right? So this is actually what we already knew from previous studies. So if you remember, we found that this part of the brain was active for syntactic movement and for syntactic complexity. But in the present study, Broca's area is activated as a function of structural hierarchy. So whenever you have syntactic structures, simple or complex, Broca's area activation pops up. Isn't that evidence for merge? They claim that it is. And it cannot be due to function words alone, as if you look at experiments which only employed function words, they did not really find the activation of Broca's area. So they claim that it's not the function, it's not the preposition itself or the determiner to activate Broca's area, but it's really the necessity of combining words together. And then there is this nice result that the more anterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus was maximally active for sentences with a verb, which suggests there is the involvement of some basic semantic operations at the level of BA45, as also found in other studies that we are going to discuss. Whereas the real basic merge operation seems to be housed in BA44. Is this really syntax? Well, the idea is that when you move to semantics and when you involve some sort of combinatorial operations, so combinatorial usually means anything that takes place when you combine the meanings of different words, you get the activation of different areas like the anterior temporal lobe and also other stuff. So the idea is that you get a selective activation of Broca's area when you have some pure syntactic sensitive stimuli. And the more semantics you get out of your stimuli, the more you're going to move to BA44. Okay? And the idea is that BA45 encodes some propositional meaning, for instance, the meaning expressed by the verb, and it integrates the meaning of the verb with the meaning of the other constituents. But BA44 is really merged. It's really hierarchy building operation. Okay? So pure syntax, BA44. And then you have the temporal regions which interact with the inferior frontal gyrus, and they sort of help out Broca's area to map the lexical information, the lexical semantic information, to the syntactic argument hierarchies. So for instance, if you have a verb has the argumental structure. It requires, let's say, a subject, an object, and a prepositional argument. All these requirements lexically specified come to the interaction of posterior superior temporal sulcus and Broca's area, specifically with BA45. Whereas BA44 really solves a very basic function of combining constituents at the syntactic level. Okay? Yeah, so this was the conclusion of this nice experiment. And yeah, before we move on, any other question? Is this clear? So yeah, so basically the conclusion is, if you really want to find pure syntactic computations in the brain, you should go to BA44, not just Broca's area in general, but the more posterior part. As soon as you move to BA45, you are already adding some semantics and some mapping of the, for instance, the propositional meaning expressed by the verb. Okay. Okay. Right. So the next paper we are going to talk about is this very cool and influential paper by Ding et al. In 2016. And it's called Cortical Tracking of Hierarchical Linguistic Structures in Connected Speech. Okay. So you will see this kind of methodology is quite different from the one that we have discussed in the last paper and also in the previous lecture, because the research question of this study was, how does the brain handles at the distinct time scales of different linguistic structure? Okay. What am I talking about? Talking about this. Take a sentence. Take a sentence like, they went on vacation. Okay. If you look at the speech stream of this sentence, just look at the distribution of energy, which is called envelope of intensity, right? Basically the envelope of the decibel of the speech. You're going to find this track, right? Now, the question for you is the following. What kind of information can we extract from this envelope? Does it identify anything at any of these three levels? Does it match the phonetic level of the syllable? Does it match the level of the word? Or does it match the level of the phrase?
I would say it doesn't match either of them, because you said it's just the intensity, so it's just the loudness, so none of these. And what probably it won't also be pertinent only in pragmatic way.
So you would say it's not really telling anything to us about any level. Right?
Well, it would be another level. It would be probably the semantic level, because raising the decibels would mean something, but not on these levels.
Right. Okay. So I think I expressed myself not very clearly. So forget that this is actually the intensity of the sentence. Okay. Just look at the shape of the red wave, at the shape of the red track. Okay. Does the lower peak of this shape, when it goes down, does it align to any of these three levels? Roughly, to some extent. Let's try. Let's take a sentence. Is there anything in this red envelope that tell us that the sentence starts here and ends here? Well, probably this kind of tail here, right? If we get rid of the tail and we put sentences one after the other, is there going to be any information in the envelope that tell us when one sentence is over and another sentence starts? Yes or no?
Well, definitely, because the prosody always tells us whether.
No. We don't have prosody here.
So,
I'm telling you, just look at the red line. So ignore that the fact that the red line is actually associated to the speech, right? Imagine that you just see the red line. So you have something that computes the intensity of the sound. So no prosody, right? No pitch, only intensity. Is this intensity aligned to one of the? Is this aligned to the level of the sentence? If I get rid of the tail here and I copy this sentence 3 times, is there going to be anything that tells me here the sentence starts and here it ends? And if so, what that is? Just take a guess. So who says yes? Who thinks yes? Thumbs up.
who thinks yes? What? Because
Okay.
it is no yes or no question.
Okay. So I'm going to try to ask this question again in the most simple way I can, okay? Is there anything in the red line, okay, that tells you, again, let's get rid of this tail, because this tail could be an indication that that this sentence is over, right? Because you have a little bit of a tail here as well, right? But let's say that we cut this little thing here and then we only have this little piece of tail. Is there anything that tell us, just looking at the red line, that the sentence is over here and that the sentence starts here?
I would say no, but that's just me.
But is the question clear, Alice?
Oh, yes. Now it's perfectly clear. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks. So one no. Anyone else? Who thinks?
I also said no.
Well, in that case, I would say yes, because it starts very abruptly, probably with the impact of the sound, and then it decreases at the end. So it would be like the end.
Right. So you're saying, yeah, if you look carefully, you might have, a short onset and a kind of, declining at the end. Okay. What about the word level?
There's
Is
some
there-
messages on the chat, if you can see the chat.
Oh, sorry. Oh, man. I start hating Zoom. Sorry about this. Yes, it matches the phonetic level. Vowels, it peaks to vowels. Noor says, right. But vowels are not the sentence boundary, right? So you have vowels for every syllable, but it's not that you have a vowel at the end of every sentence, right? So the vowel would not be a sentence indicator, would be an indicator of a syllable. You see what I'm saying, Noor? Okay, so we have seen that at the sentence level, we are kind of undecided. I would say more no than yes. What about the word level? Is there anything telling us that this is a word and that this is a word and not this?
No, I think it's more on
No,
the
right?
phonetic level.
Yeah. also because I got it wrong. So it clearly tricked me. So yeah. So sentence maybe, word, no way. What about syllables? Is there anything telling us that these are all different syllables?
Well, yeah, that
Yes.
would be due to the vowels, right?
Right. Or the intensity of, yeah, of the voicing, right? Unless you speak a very, very difficult language with very few vowels. But I don't think that that would exist. At least you need some voicing. I mean, I'm not an expert, but right, kind of the noise vocoded speech that we listen to, right? So yes, voicing and the vowels represent this burst of activity, and probably also the some consonants, like when you like the p, or the onset of the consonant probably is gonna be the first burst of intensity, and definitely the vowel. So yes, so that's a kind of exactly what they say, except that we had some doubt about the sentence, and I kind of share your doubt, right? Especially this long tail, and also I think you're kind of right that you kind of see a global envelope of the sentence, but whatever. They claim that actually the syllable level is the only level that has a close match to the envelope, to the intensity envelope. Okay. So there is nothing in the physical properties of the sound that tell you in continuous speech where the word boundary is. Okay. And probably nothing at the sentence level as well. Okay. So here's the trick. They made up sentences where the timing of each unit was controlled, experimentally controlled, and kept constant. Okay, so every syllable was presented at a 0.25 second rate, so 4 hertz, right? So, for instance, lovely kid eat apples. Lovely kids eat apples. And then words, nothing particular. But then you have the phrases rate at 2 hertz, so 2 phrases per second, and the sentence phrase at 1 second. Okay, so in 1 second they would present lovely kids eat apples. Now you might think this is a little bit too fast, but this was done in Chinese. So I guess in Chinese, Chinese words are actually quite short, and in 1 second you can say a lot of things, basically. Okay. So yeah, so this was their idea, and the big question was, how does our brain use acoustic and phonological cues to build and represent abstract linguistic structures in real time? So is there anything in our brain which is peaking at the same level as these units peak, assuming that there is nothing in the speech stream telling us anything about that? Okay. So, right. So they're looking for waves or network activation, which is sensitive to this different level of representation. So if you're going to find a wave that is synchronized with the 4 hertz, this is going to be probably tuned to syllables. If you're going to find a wave that is tuned to 0.5 seconds rate, so 2 hertz, this is going to be tuned to small phrases, constituents. If you're going to find a wave that is tuned every second, that's going to be a sentence. Okay. Assuming that the only cue you get from the input is this level. Anything else is made up by your brain. Does this seem reasonable? Do you have any objection? or let's wait for objection and let's see what's coming out, okay? Right, so an MEG experiment, of course, because you need a very, very high temporal resolution if you want to investigate these fine grain levels. And then they had some independently synthesized syllables in Mandarin, okay? No co-articulation, only syntactic, semantic, and lexical cues. Co-articulation is the phenomenon when you sort of merge the sound of one syllable into the sound of the other. Whereas they decided to present syllable by syllable, okay? To make sure that you would have this information in the speech stream. And they were presented at 4 Hz, so 4 syllables per second. So in the English version of this experiment, it would look like this. Every sentence was made by adjective, noun, verb, noun. Fat rat sends fear. Wood shelf holds cans. Teen apes hunt bugs. Rude cats claw dogs. So see, every word is monosyllabic, and they're all presented at the same rate, and they're all meaningful. So it's like a short sentence with some meaning, okay? So this is not just about investigating syntax by itself, but it's really investigating how our brain builds up the structure, which are arguably contain some syntactic and also some semantic information and also some lexical information, okay? So for instance, to identify words, you would need some lexical information. To identify phrases, you would need lexical, syntactic, and semantic information, and likewise for sentences. All right. So the MEG signal was extracted in the frequency domain. So they would do a frequency analysis to identify which brainwaves would represent a frequency feature that is tuned to this, to the frequency of this phenomena, okay? So if you want to know if any brain waves is sensitive to sentences, this brain wave would have to have a 1 Hz timing, okay? A 1 Hz wavelength. Phase, 1 Hz phase. All right. So yeah. So the response power, which is basically a Fourier transformation, a frequency analysis, right? Of every frequency is extracted. And then if you see a peak at some level, it means that you have a process or you have a, you know, a network synchronized activity, which is working at that rate with that phase length, okay? Okay, so here's the results. Again, 1 Hz sentence level, 2 Hz phrase level, 4 Hz syllable level. All right, and also in Chinese, the word level and the syllable level was the same because each syllable would correspond to a word, okay? So again, no acoustic cues that would signal phrase or sentence boundaries. They would use this synthesized speech with no prosody information and no boundaries between one sentence and the other. So all these sentences will be put one after the other. Rude cats, claw dogs, rich cooks, brave tea, fun games, waste time, huge waves, hit ships, deaf ears, hear you, blah, 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 like this, okay? Maybe I also have this, well, I'm gonna put this later. So yeah, so if you only look at the stimulus properties, the only peak you get is at 4 Hz, because that's the presentation of the isolated syllables, okay? So that's how your input looks like. No other peak at any other frequency, okay? So what we want to know is our brain gonna show up a synchronized activity at any other level, especially at the sentence level, 1 Hz, and at the phrase level, 2 Hz? Right. So if it does that, it must be the consequence of some internal structure building, sentences and phrases. Okay. And the answer is yes. That's what they found. So they found this peak of activity at 1 hertz, this peak of activity at 2 hertz, a little peak at 3, not significant, and a peak at 4, which is not surprising. Okay. And this activity, as you can see, was seen bilaterally, which means both hemispheres were responding to that particular frequency. Okay. So the wave they found, which is more like a synchronized, it's called cortical entrainment. So basically, it's a synchronized activity of a network which is responding at a certain frequency. It was active bilaterally, so produced by both hemispheres. Okay. Whereas if you only look, whereas if they only look at the left hemisphere, they would only find this. So you really need that. You really need to look at both hemispheres if you want to find this result. Okay, which is also interesting. Okay. So again, this is kind of a schema of your of your structure, of the linguistic structure of your stimulus, and that's what they found. One peak, one power peak at 1 hertz. So this is due to a cortical activity tracking the sentences. Another peak at 2 hertz, cortical activity tracking the phrases, and a peak at 4 hertz tracking the syllables presentation. But the signal only included overt physical information, acoustic information about this level and not about these two levels. So this must be something reflecting structure building in our brain. Okay. Okay. Should we have a quick break before continuing? And okay, like 5 minutes, and then we finish this experiment. Okay. 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 So. All right. So yeah. So again, with the new technology, I can show you. Can show you the peak, the sentence peak. There you go. The phrase peak, and the syllable peak. Okay. Yeah. So. Oh, but this is getting okay. This is gonna be all the drawing that I'm gonna make. Right. So. Okay. So then, when you do an experiment like this, you're gonna have a lot of critics and a lot of counter arguments. So in order to make sure that what you find is really to be interpreted in the way you interpret it, and for in the specific case, in order to be sure that this activity is really time locked and is really reflecting this kind of covert processes ongoing in our brain, what you need to do, if you remember also from the other experiments, is to run a lot of control experiments, right? And so the first thing that you might do is to stick to your Chinese material and Chinese listeners, and to present them a speech stream composed by monosyllabic words which do not which do not form sentences and phrases, okay? Like cat, dog, mouse, and stuff like this. And what you expect, if what you're finding is really, really due to sentence and phrase synchronized processes, is that these processes are not going to show up in this control experiment. And yes, that's what I found. So with random syllables, with acoustic properties preserved, but no phrases and sentences, they only found the peak at 4 Hz, okay? So this was good. And then you want to say, okay, so let's see if we only have bisyllabic phrases, but no sentences composed by 4 syllables, we elicit the 2 Hz peak, the one that is synchronized to the phrase. Guess what? They found it. Adopting only bisyllabic phrase structures, they elicited the 2 Hz cortical activity, 4 Hz cortical activity, but no activity at 1 Hz. So no activity tracking sentences, as there were no sentences. Okay? So that's great. And then what about, instead of having a structure composed by 2 phrases merging into 1 sentence, we have a structure with 1 specifier-like thing here, and then a 3 syllables sentence. Okay? Sorry, 3 syllables phrase. So this could be, I don't know, I don't know, walk very fast. And this is John. Kind of, yeah, John walks very fast. Okay. And then in this new experiment, they found the peak at the sentence level, they found the peak at the syllable level, and they found this nice new peak at 3 Hz, which is kind of representing this different structure. Okay. So 3 syllables noun phrase, peak at 3 Hz. Cool. So all these controls were fine. And then the next step was to take the Chinese material, so sentence in Mandarin, and give it to English native speakers. And then, assuming that English speakers know very little about Mandarin, you would expect to find only the syllable peak, which is the one represented in the acoustic properties of the speech stream. And again, they found it. Again, English speakers listening to Chinese material, only syllabic peak. And then they say, okay, let's replicate the same experiment in English. Maybe that was reflecting some properties of Chinese. What if we have it in English? Again, experiment with four syllables, random 4 syllables with acoustic properties preserved, but no phrases, sentences, only peak at 4 Hz. Same experiment with bisyllabic phrases merging into a 4-syllabic sentence, and exactly the same result. Peak at 4, peak at 2, and peak at 1 Hz. Okay? So, really cool results. Really cool. Any question? Anything that is not clear? Any critic? Any curiosity? Okay. So this is all cool, right? But it's not telling a lot about the property and specifically about the localization of these neural networks that are synchronized and tracking the properties of the sentences, right? So cortical tracking means that you are interested in those cortical networks that are tracking these hierarchical properties, these hierarchical linguistic structures in connected speech. Okay, it's also called cortical entrainment. All right. So how can we dive into the cortex and attempt to localize these processes? We could do source localization with MEG, but if you want to be fancier and if you have big resources available, you can also do electrocorticography, which is intracranial recording. What does it mean? That you literally put an electrode inside your cortex and you can record the electricity generated by a single electrode or a very small a single neuron or a very small population of neurons, okay, depending on the size of your electrode. Cool. So that's what they did. That's how electrocorticography looks like. Your skull is removed and you have this nice layer of kind of EEG like electrocorticography, okay? And then you can put it wherever you want. And then that has the highest resolution you can have, because then you don't have any distortion of the skull, no distortion of the meninges. You really pick up the electricity of the piece of cortex that you put your electrode on, right? So you might wonder, like, yeah, but like, who's gonna do that? Who's gonna be a subject for that? So you usually do this with people that are undergoing brain surgery, and usually the best kind of patients are epileptic patients that undergo surgery for pharmacological resistant epilepsy. So those kind of very, very strong epileptic syndrome, they cannot be cured with just medications, okay? So, right. So what you do is just to put your electrodes in, the widest area that you can cover, right? And that's all the electrodes they put on 3 patients on the left hemisphere and 2 patients on the right hemisphere, okay? So very, very cool technology, also called ECOG or ECOG, okay? Electrocorticography. Okay. So again, same trick. You basically tune your recorded stream to the power spectrum of the processes that you're interested in. So now we know that we are interested at 1, 2, and 4 hertz, okay? And there are like 2 kind of bands to do this. So one is called high gamma band in this frequency, and the other one is a low gamma band. We're not gonna get into the details. If you're interested in this, read the papers, which is kind of complex. But roughly speaking, the idea is that in this methodology, you can actually identify those electrodes that pick up the electricity of the underlying neurons, which are really the generators of the effect that you found with the MEG, okay? And for the sentence peak, they found these electrodes that are active, whereas, the sentence are the green one, the phrase, so 2 hertz, are the blue ones, and those who would be responding to both sentences or phrases are the red ones, okay? So, big question for you. What kind of regions of the brain you can see underneath this electrode? Is there anything that looks familiar to you? So first of all,
again, the STG.
sorry?
The STG.
The SDG, right? Which one is it? On the right or on the left? Big question. So if you remember, I told you that a very useful way to figure out which one is the left is the is the front part of your brain and which one is the back part of your brain is to look at the big frontal gyrus here, the big frontal bump, and then this kind of double bump, which is basically the joint between the frontal and the temporal cortex, from which your lateral sulcus or Sylvian fissure starts from, right? So this is your Sylvian fissure, and this would be your central fissure. Wait, yeah, one is precentral, one is central. So this is the front, right? This is your frontal lobe, and this is your temporal lobe. So where is STG? Is it here or is it here?
It's under the Sylvian fissure on the temporal lobe.
Right. So on the left, on the right, sorry, right? Right here. Okay. This is your superior temporal gyrus. This is the superior temporal sulcus. This is your middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus. Good. And what is this? And also this. Does it ring a bell? Anyone?
Check the chat. Someone's putting messages up there.
Broca's area, yeah. Right. Yeah. Because this is the frontal lobe, right? And this is your inferior frontal gyrus, inferior, middle, and superior. And this is exactly your Broca's region. In fact, this one here is your Broca's region. This is already the pre-central gyrus, I guess. So you kind of can recognize the Broca region when it does kind of these twists here right after the pre-central gyrus. Okay, so it's right here, Broca and Wernicke, Broca and Wernicke. And if you look at all these experiments with electrocorticography, you know, unsurprisingly, what they find in association with verbal stimuli is always the activation of these two areas, which, you know, not by chance they have been dubbed the language areas, right? Cool. So yes, that's nice. The other interesting information that we can see from this, but then we are gonna look at that later. But yeah, you see that certain electrodes are only responding to phrases, and other electrodes are only responding to sentences. So there is some specificity at the level of also within these areas, there is some specificity about certain neural population that are either responding to phrases or to sentences. And then there are some more general effects, a more general neural population, which are actually responding to both. Okay, so this is interesting. Okay, right. So the way they called them was like spatially dissociable sentential and phrasal representation. What does it mean, spatially dissociable? That occupy different spaces in the brain, and that they would only respond to sentences or to phrases. Okay. Right. And then if you move to other gamma bands, to other bands, So this would be high gamma band, this would be lower gamma band. Again, there are some details about electrocorticography, but then again, you would find similar activations, a little bit more widespread. And now here, yeah, you also see some more anterior parts of your kind of enlarged Broca's region. So this would be BA47. This would be the frontal operculum. And you also see some activation here at the temporoparietal junction. And this guy here called angular gyrus, okay, which we're going to talk about later. In fact, the angular gyrus is this one. This is more like a supramarginal gyrus, which you might remember from the fact that is included in Wernicke's region. But, you know, aside technicalities, again, you see that the big blob of activation is basically distributed in your inferior frontal gyrus and your superior temporal gyrus, and then also some stuff on your premotor cortex, okay? This is premotor cortex. So this is actually a motor, something that is really related to a cortex processing movements. And this is your motor cortex, I hope. Somewhere should be also the somatosensory cortex. I think it's more backwards. Yeah. And yeah, and this is your MTG, and you see also some activation in your MTG and some posterior activation here at the border between the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. Okay, and we are going to talk about this stuff in the classes about semantics. But yeah, so again, all the green electrodes only respond to sentences, all the blue electrodes only respond to phrases, and all the red electrodes respond to both, okay? So certain electrodes only respond to one of these two linguistic structures. And some of them respond to both. Okay, so again, now this is a mistake. This is not the temporoparietal junction. The temporoparietal junction is actually here, right? This is more the premotor cortex and the precentral, the areas near the precentral gyrus, okay? So that's the mistake. Cool. So, right, so now they also mention some specific left activation of inferior frontal gyrus and bilateral activation of your posterior STG, which would be this right here, okay? And right, at the high gamma band and the low gamma band, you see that other activation pop out, this prefrontal activation, and also this activation at the temporoparietal junction. Okay. And then again, similar. So sorry, these were at the phrasal rate, and these were at the sentential rate. Okay. So these are only the electrodes that respond specifically to the phrase, and these are the ones who respond specifically to the sentence. And they are dissociated. So those who respond to the phrase do not respond to the sentence, and those who respond to the sentence do not respond to the phrase. And some of them respond to both. So, some interesting conclusion. So, high and low frequency responses for phrases and sentences were reflected in similar brain areas. So you have all these electrodes responding at these two levels of analysis for both phrases and sentences, but they were not reflected in the same electrode. some electrodes were specifically responding to phrases and some of them were responding to sentences. And now, these low frequency neural oscillation, why are they low frequency? Because they are synchronized to 2 and 1 hertz, which is quite low, like 1 peak every second. So synchronized to sentence and to phrase rate, right? They are called cortical entrainment to speech. So it's as if your the neural oscillation of your cortex, in a way, they tune to certain properties of the linguistic input, although these properties are not contained in the acoustic properties of the input itself, but they are built up by your brain. And then they project to other areas, which probably are important to modulate, interconnect, and generate predictions about, for instance, the upcoming material. So, right. So the idea is that this cortical entrainment to speech is not related to a low-level auditory encoding or to a low-level language processing, but it's beyond a stimulus-bound analysis. So it's really reflected about some kind of analysis, some kind of structure that our brain is building up out of a continuous stimulus. So it reflects the internal construction of large linguistic structure. Okay. Good. So before moving on, I would like to hear if you have any criticism or any doubt about the study, or if you buy everything they say.
I just have a question.
Yes.
Regarding the English speaker listening to Chinese words or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the point, that English speaker can't differentiate between Chinese words and sentences, right? Is that the whole point?
Yeah.
Or
So
did I miss something?
Yes. So the whole point is that, you know, if I listen to Chinese, to Mandarin, to a Mandarin stream of syllables, to me they're all the same, right? I mean, I hear different sounds.
Yeah, sure, but you can't.
Right.
Yeah.
I have no idea how to put them together. If
Okay,
I listen to German, then maybe I would be able to do some structure building. So you know, it's I think it's nice to compare this to the scrambled speech experiment, right? And by scrambled, I don't mean scrambling in German, but like literally scrambling. So I'm referring to the overall study, right, where they took German speech and they presented it to English people to make sure that they would not access the meaning of these sentences, right? But only the speech properties, like the acoustic speech properties, right?
So that's the main point, that people don't kind of infer the meaning by knowing what the word should be.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
In that experiment, and also in this condition, right? But in the other condition, like in this one, yes, they do, because they hear.
Yeah, sure, but it's two different
Exactly.
things.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah. So.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I can tell you that there is a paper that is criticizing this work. And so what they did was to analyze the frequency lexical features of the words, of the stimuli they used. And they concluded that actually you could do this, you could sort of extract this peak, this frequency peak in the signal, just by relying on the lexical dependencies between words, just based on the frequency. So for instance, yeah. No. Sorry. So, yeah. For instance, they claim that you know, when you have a verb like eat and a noun like apples, even without using any syntax, any structure, any semantics, just at the frequency of co-occurrence of the lexical words, you would know that these two guys probably are associated. And then after this guy, it's going to be a phrase boundary, right? Because eat apples occur very frequently in language, but not apples and the next word of the next sentence. So in this control experiment, they claim that what they actually found could be explained just by statistical, the extraction of statistical regularity only based at the lexical level. Okay. Now, we don't have time to go through that paper. I kind of think that this experiment is quite convincing, right? Because they have all these controls and all these interesting conditions. So I quite buy this story. But if you are a lexicalist or an anti-structure guy, then you might want to read that paper. So I'm gonna look that up. I'm gonna put it in the paper pool because I think it's interesting. Okay. And then probably there is a reply by this guy to the other paper, so you know that they keep on arguing with each other for years. But I think this is a very interesting topic. Did you see this point? Did you see the rationale of this counter argument? That only relying on certain statistical properties, you could actually extract the same effects. Okay. All right. So for your happiness, I have another intermezzo now, where I'm gonna bother you with some crazy philosophical reflection of language. No, I'm kidding. I'm gonna just try to wrap up what we have done and tell you some kind of general notions, right? Right. So I will try to do this quite quickly, but I would like, I have a job for you. I have a task, okay? I would like to ask you something. I would like that each one of you, by the next time, prepares one question at least, or even two, or even three, but at least one question on the stuff that we have talked about, on any argument, okay? You prepare this question and you write it to me as a message on Moodle, okay? Before the next lecture. Because unfortunately, you know, one of the downside of this thing of, you know, of the online teaching is that it is more difficult for me to elicit your reaction and your comments, right? Which is, you know, it's completely fine. It's also difficult in real teaching, but like in this way, I cannot threaten you personally, right? So there's no way that I can like try to, you know, to force you to do this. So that's gonna be my way to do this. Please, that's an assignment, okay? If you don't do this, you'll be punished forever. And no, I'm kidding. But please do it, okay? Write me one question, whatever you want, specific, general, whatever you like, about something that you haven't understood or something that you would like to be discussed a little bit more, or just some curiosity, anything, right? So for instance, Valeria asked me about the functional takeover. So I'm gonna try to do something with that, but you are, you know, really anything that sort of tickles your interest. Okay. Right, so let's have this rush of summary. So I have one cooked already. Awesome. It's, you know, it's your decision whether you want to shoot it now or keep it for the next time. Up to you. So while you think about this, I'm going to continue. And yeah, so if you remember, we started with this very nice experiment by Scott et al., which found a specificity for the left hemisphere for phonological and lexical auditory information, right? You remember intelligible speech versus not intelligible speech with all the appropriate controls, right? He was bothered that in no study anyone found the specificity for the left hemisphere, although we know that language is mainly processed on the left hemisphere, especially the lexical aspects of language. So this was the first experiment. Especially, he found the difference between the left STG that was active for the phonetic contrast versus the left anterior STS, which was active for the intelligibility, right? And we know that this is also connected with A1, Heschel gyrus, which is your primary auditory cortex. All right. So then we move to Overath et al., and he found the bilateral activation again of SDS, this time more widespread, so not specifically anterior, but more distributed on the SDS, and it was tuned to acoustic temporal structure of speech, independently of lexical syntactic info, right? And we see kind of some difference between the results of the study, because if you have that STS is tuned to the low level property of speech, then you would expect the STS to be active for the phonetic contrast and not for the intelligibility, okay? So again, interesting conflicting results to some extent, probably not completely. Probably they would say that this is really an effect specific to the left anterior STS, which is probably where your lexical information connects to your phonological information. Whereas when you go to more lower properties, then you have a bilateral, more widespread activation of the whole STS, okay? Right? Then, yeah, and then if you remember, they also found this half a second sensitivity above which you didn't have the increase of signal anymore, and this sort of stream of processing which goes from primary auditory cortex, Heschel gyrus, to planum temporale, second auditory cortex, to STS, associative cortex. Right. So when I was in Vienna a few years ago, there was a student called Martina, very fun, and she always had a lot of nice questions. So this was my favorite question she had, and she was like, you know, these people are using STS and STG and, you know, interchangeably sometimes. Are we sure that this is just not the same area, right? Is always superior temporal gyrus. In a way, I mean, okay, the sulcus is a little bit more inside, but it's kind of part of the superior temporal cortex. So are we sure that these are not exactly the same area? And the answer is no, they're not. They're not the same area. So if you look at a kind of picture of a 3D picture of the brain, where you have the temporal cortex highlighted, this is the superior temporal gyrus, the STG, right? This is confusing because this is switched. So this is the right hemisphere, but, you know, not a big issue. It goes from here to here, and your Wernicke's area would be this. So a little bit of the superior marginal gyrus and a little bit of your superior temporal gyrus. Sorry, this is this probably, yeah. And this is your superior temporal sulcus. So the red area is the sulcus, and the green area is the gyrus. Okay. So the sulcus is the groove. So it's more ventral, it's more inside your brain. But if you unfold the cortex to make a big balloon of your cortex unfold, then you see that they are different areas. Of course, they are contiguous, overlapping a little bit, but they're not the same part, okay? In some papers, even neuroscientists sometimes confuse areas. So sometimes they call areas with different names, right? Sometimes, for instance, they call the angular gyrus intraparietal sulcus or parietal posterior cortex, whatever. So you have to be careful, okay? The best way is to look at the coordinates and try to exactly see where the activation is. But in general, it's important to know that these guys are all different parts of the brain. Okay, right. So the STS separates STG from MTG. Nice. Right. Are STG or STS Wernicke's area, right? I told you before that the activation of the Ding et al. Study was sort of encompassing Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Some neuroscientists would even get mad at me because I used the terminology Wernicke's area, right? So, for instance, binder. So, no, Wernicke's area is only posterior STG and superior marginal gyrus. Right. So I told you already, the functional definition of Wernicke's area is very problematic. So it is not true that if you have a damage to Wernicke's area, you're going to have a pure damage to impaired comprehension, right? Because Wernicke's area has a major role in speech production because it contains the phonological representation of words. And if you have to pronounce a word, you need to recover the phonological representation and turn it into a motor representation, which is basically the instructions that move your lips and your vocal cord in order to make the sounds you want to make. Okay? So this blue bubble here is Wernicke's area. And you see, this is all your superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, inferior temporal gyrus, okay? And this is where you have your phoneme perception. So this anterior part of your STG correspond to more or less this kind of activation of phonetic contrast by Scott, okay? And then when you move to STS, you have the effect of an intelligibility because probably you are moving a little bit more to the areas that are important for lexicon. And I can spoil you already. I can give you a spoiler of the next classes. Many people think that the lexicon is kind of localized in the MTG. So if you move more inferiorly along the temporal cortex, okay? In the binder representation, this is all word meaning. So the meaning of the word is here, anterior temporal lobes, middle and inferior temporal gyrus, and this big red blob, which is basically the angular gyrus, and then extending backwards towards parietal and parietal occipital junction, okay? So basically this is all parietal. Yeah, so you see, phoneme perception, phonological retrieval, and word meaning. Okay, what is the difference between phoneme perception and phonological retrieval? So at the level of phonemes, you are still processing phonetic sounds. And at the level of phonology, you are already combining phonemes into phonological entities. And we have seen that experiment about contrasting phoneme perception and phonological perception. right? So the idea is that here, this is also very important when you have to retrieve phonological material. So this is like a sort of, this contains representation that are both important for retrieval and for perception, whereas this is mainly for perception of speech and perception of sound related to speech, okay? According to Binder. And then we have seen that things are actually more complex than this. For instance, if you take this very complex paper, is there a question? No. Okay. If you take this complex paper by Hickok and Poppel, you see a very, very complex model of the brain, right? But if we highlight our STG and our STS, you see that there is some connection to the stuff we talked about before. So here you have spectrotemporal analysis of the sound over Earth experiment, the quills, the scrambled quills. And if you move the little bit towards the more inferior part of your temporal lobe, basically on the STS, here you have more the phonological network, okay? So moving from STG, from anterior STG to more posterior STS, you go from a more phonetic analysis of the sound or more low-level spectrotemporal analysis of the sound to a more phonological based analysis of the sound, okay? So your phonology would right be here. Okay. Yes. So I'm going to answer Maria's question and then I think we can call it a day. When you said lexicon before, is that mental lexicon? Another $1 million question, Maria. I don't know. I mean, unfortunately, people use these terms often in a very loose way, right? But often these terms are very, very underspecified, right? So I guess what you mean by mental lexicon might be something like the set of representations for words and concepts in your mind, right? But lexicon can be thought of as a way more low-level collection of all the stuff with UG and mental lexicon. Oh well, right. So let me give you what I try to come up with like a simple answer. Okay, the most, if you ask a neuroscientist what the lexicon is, neuroscientists would tell you, look, actually that's what Binder told me. I don't even think there are words, right? I mean, it's a little bit an extreme conclusion, but what he meant by this is that according to some perspective, all there is sounds and meanings. And then all that our brain does is compute some mappings of these sounds onto meaning representations, okay? According to some neuroscientists, in a way, this is exactly what lexicon does. It takes some patterns of sounds and it maps it into some patterns of meanings. Now, we as linguists, we think that this ontology is much, much, much richer, right? So this mapping, indeed, it sort of, it represents a mapping of different levels. So for instance, you would have words, and words, they sort of convey information about the phonology. So how would you express these words in real communication, in speech? they would express information about their meaning, so the lexical meaning of words, but they would also express information about how they can be combined together. For instance, what kind of lexical category they have. And then when you define lexical category, you are really saying something that sort of rings a bell about mental lexicon and UG stuff, right? For instance, you have a class of determiners. Determiner is a word that can create determinant phrases. So if you have that kind of lexical item, then it can be composed with nouns, for instance. But if you have I don't know, an adverb, that cannot really be composed with a noun if it's an adverb, if it's a verbal adverb, right? So the more linguistically we get, the more levels we have with respect to these representations, and the more our ontologies become enriched. Okay, but at a very low neuroscientific level, the simplest way we can sort of define lexicon, for instance, is just information about mapping different kind of representation. And if you think about concepts, they are also mapping of activation of movements, perceptions, knowledge about how to use tools, and memories. So at some level, our brain or our lexicon can be a sort of a multidimensional mapping of different kind of representations all together. And then, and then someone say, okay, but now how does this explain why the boy runs is a well-formed sentence, but the runs boy is horrible, right? And then, you might want to add some syntactic operations to this domain, and some semantic operations, and maybe some pragmatics, and maybe some intonation, and maybe some morphology, and then we have to differentiate all these representations, and then we better have some parts of the brain which are specifically processing those different representations. Okay, I hope this was a useful answer. But yeah, we're going to talk about these things over and over and over in the remaining classes. Okay, all right, so thank you, and thanks everyone, and please write me one question by the next time, and I will try to answer them. Okay.